It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the world of learning new concepts and current trends, so let's start. Okay, let's just jump right in. Imagine this. You've poured your heart and mind into a piece of writing. It's yours. But then, an automated system looks at it and questions everything. If you've ever been in that spot, or you're worried you might be, this is for you. And then, you see this question. It's unsettling, right? It's a question that puts your work, your very integrity on trial, all because of a computational review. You know you wrote it. Of course you do. Every single word. But some piece of software is telling you, I'm not so sure. It's a really strange and frustrating place to be. You're completely certain, but a mechanism isn't. Now, take a look at this number, 1.56%. According to our source material, that's how often these systems get it wrong. Now, that might not sound like a huge number, but think about it. For every 100 pieces of writing, that means 1 or 2 could be flagged incorrectly. That's a pretty significant chance for any writer. So here's the deal. We're not just going to stare at the problem. We are going to dig in and figure out why these mix-ups happen from the point of view of the assessment tool itself. And way more importantly, we'll get into the proactive steps you can take to protect your work. So let's pop the hood, shall we? To really get why a piece of human writing might get a high computational origin rating, we have to first understand what these systems are even looking for, and what trips them up. We're going to look at 3 main culprits that can lead to a wrong call. First, the subtle effect of the digital writing assistants you might be using. Second, when a piece of writing is just too short. And third, when the text follows a very standard or conventional format. Alright, let's tackle the biggest cause of these problems, and it's something a lot of us use: electronic writing assistants. This one is by far the most frequent reason for misreading. And this is where the real disconnect happens. You know, your goal is just to polish your work, right? Make it better. But these helper programs, they often smooth out your sentences, or suggest very common words, which kind of simplifies the text. From the perspective of the assessment mechanism, that lower variety looks like a sign that a person wasn't fully involved. This quote from the source material really says it all. It's crystal clear. These composition examiners are super sensitive. Any kind of interaction, whether you're using it to plan, edit, or rewrite, can push that computational value higher. It's not saying the whole thing was generated, just that it sees a program's fingerprints somewhere in the process. And we're not talking about some obscure specialized software here. We're talking about everyday tools like Grammarly, Quillbot, even the editor that's now built right into Microsoft Word. They're all powered by the kind of complex processes these examiners are built to notice. Using them is almost guaranteed to affect the outcome. Okay, so moving on from digital tools, the very shape of your writing can play a role. Let's dig into how the length and the structure of your text can, believe it or not, accidentally raise some red flags. So what do we mean by conventional content? Well, it's just parts of your writing that follow a really standard, predictable pattern. Think about an introduction that starts super broad and then narrows down, or a conclusion that just rehashes the main points. Even something as simple as a works cited page with its rigid format can fit this description. The first structural issue is pretty straightforward. The text is just too short. A composition examiner needs a good amount of material to work with to make a solid judgment call. If it only gets a tiny sample, like just 1 paragraph, its findings just isn't going to be as dependable. And that brings us to this key number, 100. The source recommends that any text you submit for a check should be at least 100 words. Honestly, longer is even better. Why? Well, because the more you write, the more evidence you provide of your unique voice, giving the examiner more data to get a reliable result. The second issue is all about those predictable arrangements. Highly structured writing, like a classic 5-paragraph essay, can sometimes look a little too neat, a little too much like something a generative system might produce. This doesn't mean your writing is bad. It's just that its conventional structure can be misunderstood by the assessment tool. Alright, so we've looked at the problems. Now for the most important part. What can you actually do about it? Let's get into some actionable steps you can take to make sure your work is recognized as your own. Here's your game plan. It's pretty simple. First, try to avoid using any digital aids for generating, editing, or even planning out your writing. Second, always submit the whole thing for examination, not just a little piece of it, and make sure it's well over that 100-word minimum. And finally, you might even consider removing really formulaic sections, like a bibliography, before you submit it. Now, let's pull back for a second. We've been talking about the nuts and bolts, but there's a much bigger conversation we need to have here about how these composition examiners are used responsibly, especially when the stakes are really high. This quote from the source really just hits you, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of the issue. We're talking about tools that can have huge real-world impacts, especially for students. A single number from a calculation should never, ever be the final say on a person's work or on their character. And really, this is the proper role for these systems. They're meant to be an aid, a single data point to consider, not some kind of infallible judge. Their findings have to be interpreted with context, with nuance, and with careful human oversight. They're just not perfect, and we can't pretend they are. So we're going to end with a question for you to think about. As these automated assessments become more and more common, what's the right balance? How do we use the information these tools give us without letting it completely overshadow the essential, and let's face it, often more insightful element of human judgment? That really is the critical question we all need to be asking.